Welcome to the Space's Net Carbon Zero Roundtable discussion. I'm Alex G, Operations Director at MPS Peterborough and leading on the Space's Net Carbon Zero workstream. Today, we're delighted to introduce you to four leading thinkers and practitioners around the Net Carbon Zero agenda. And we'll be exploring, amongst other things, if there's an acceptable ratio of greening to offsetting and what that might look like, and to determine, as custodians of public spaces, if we have an ethical responsibility to enhance the assets we know may become surplus to requirements. So we hope some interesting areas to explore. And if you want to join in, please post your questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to try and weave them in where we can. Before we get into the discussion, I'd like to introduce our guests for this afternoon. Patrick Begg, Outdoors and Natural Resources Director at the National Trust. Patrick leads the Trust's thinking on climate change, including energy use and generation, wider adaptation strategies, and pressures on natural resources, covering some of the nation's most naturally and culturally rich landscapes. An archaeologist by trade before moving into policy and planning, Patrick plays a leading role in national policy advocacy work around climate change, farming, soils, and water. And his experience spans nature, conservation, and economics. Patrick, welcome this afternoon.
Thanks, Alex. Nice to be here.
We're also joined by Sheryl French, Programme Director of the Energy Investment Unit at Cambridgeshire County Council. Sheryl has over 20 years' experience working in local government at senior positions covering environment, regeneration and growth. A physicist by trade before undertaking a research master's from the UEA in strategic environmental assessment and political decision making. Sheryl has focused on analysing growth plans in Cambridgeshire for their future carbon impacts and mobilising energy investment into renewables and energy efficiency investments to ensure the council is delivering a sustainable and low carbon future. Sheryl, welcome this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Alex.
Next, we have Dr. Shaun Fitzgerald, Director of Research in the Centre for Climate Repair at Cambridge. Shaun is a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, working at the interface of academic research, business, government policy and public engagement. He's worked extensively on the commercialisation of new intellectual property arising from university research and supported the UK government in rewriting of policy documents for building standards. Prior to joining the Centre for Climate Repair, Shaun was the Director of the Royal Institution, overseeing the programme for engaging the public with science and engineering. Dr. Shaun Fitzgerald, you're very welcome this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
And finally, last but not least, we're joined by Marina Robertson, Senior Director at the Norse Group with responsibility for Norse Consulting, delivering climate and carbon solutions to the public sector. Marina has a degree in environmental studies and a master's in environmental management and is currently undertaking an MBA. She's led public sector services in areas such as transformation, property, capital delivery, inclusive economic growth, housing and regeneration, and has worked on some notable schemes, including the new Wembley Stadium and the Olympic legacy. Marina, you're very welcome this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Alex. Lovely to be here.
Well, thank you. Thank you one and all for taking part this afternoon, and also for Siri, who seems to want to engage with me as we're going through the podcast. For our audience, we've recorded a short podcast with each of our guests, and these are available to listen to from the Spaces website. I hope you enjoy listening to them as much as I enjoyed recording them. So before we launch into the discussion in earnest, I'd like to invite each of you for a minute or two just to explain to our audience what you do and why it's important. And Patrick, if we could start with you, please.
Thanks, Alex. I try and do my bit to save the planet. I think that's why I do my job. I'm dead lucky as well in that I get to think about these things and actually see thought through to delivery, because the National Trust is a big landowner. We have a lot of assets, we have a lot of land. So we tend to try and practice what we preach. I suppose that's the thing I try to bring to a lot of the discussions that I partake in is not only is there a clever thought, but there is actually some evidence about how it might work on the ground and our experience of the things that don't work. So I guess that says a little bit about how I do my job and also why I'm in it. Is that good for now, Alex?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Patrick. Sheryl, can I invite you to do the same, please?
So I work at Cambridgeshire County Council. I'm in the Place and Economy Directorate, and I have a team which is effectively working on the implementation of the climate change and environment strategy that the council adopted. So part of our work is delivering on carbon reporting, so collecting all the data to see what our carbon footprint is and trying to see how we can reduce it according to our targets. Part of our work is also implementation of projects. So we have a £100 million plus programme of energy projects. Some of them are efficiency projects. Some of them are buildings related projects. So swapping out gas and oil for low carbon heating. And some of them are on our rural estate or other pieces of land to either generate renewable energy or to work with our community to do shared schemes to help them decarbonise at the same time as the rest of us. But I think probably the area that is most interesting, and I think probably links in a bit with Shaun, is that we're also looking for new business models. So, you know, what does this new economy look like in the future? How do we value carbon? How do we monetize natural capital? And so we do explore and look at some of those new business models as well. So why is the work that I do important? I think in local authorities, you need to, because you have planning powers, you have a whole number of regulatory powers, you work closely with the community. It's very much about showing what can be done, leading by example, and also sharing best practice with businesses, with your community and with others to be able to speed everything up. So I think as a role model, I think it's really important, the role and the work that we do. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Sheryl. And I think you've opened up there a number of things that we will touch on throughout the course of the discussion. So an interesting intro into what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Shaun, if I could come to you, please.
Indeed. So it's very good to be with you all. Good afternoon. I have spent nearly all of my career, this is from the early 90s, worrying and working on emissions reduction. So I spent the very first part of my career doing green energy supply. I got into the world of geothermal reservoir engineering, and I did academic research as well as working in that rather lovely industry, and took me to some incredible parts of the world. Geothermal is blessed with actually being able to go to volcanic regions where it's lush vegetation. So I've done green energy supply, and then more latterly worked in the area of demand reduction, energy demand reduction. So I see this as a set of scales. You provide green energy and you try and use less of it in the first place through energy efficient building design. And then recently I've taken up the helm of director of the Centre for Climate Repair, and it's got 3 objectives, and those 3 are as follows. Firstly, reducing emissions, deep and rapid emissions reduction. We've got too many carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere though. So we've got to go harder than getting to zero. We've got to go beyond that. And therefore the second objective is greenhouse gas removal, developing technologies, approaches where we can actually start taking carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And objective number 3, Alex, is worrying about what on earth is going to happen if we take too long to do both of the first 2. So looking at, gosh, how might we refreeze the Arctic? And it's really as a result of us being too tardy with objectives 1 and 2. And it doesn't seem appropriate to therefore ignore the reality that we may see sort of significant diminishment of the ice in the Antarctic, Greenland, Arctic and the Himalayas. Therefore, what might we do? So those are the 3 objectives. And today, we're probably going to be looking primarily at objectives 1 and 2, looking at emissions reduction. And then when we maybe talk about offsets and things like that, Alex, the inclusion of greenhouse gas removal.
Thank you, Shaun. That's really interesting. And actually, we may come back to this point about number 3, which is, have you got, and are there technologies in place to either reverse or to bring us back around to a, I'm not sure whether you call it a positive or negative carbon baseline, where we are doing more than zero, as you rightly say. But
we can expand later.
We'll try to get to that. Thank you very much. Marina, if I can invite you to do the same, please.
Thank you very much, Alex. And oh my God, what an exceptional panel, and so privileged to be part of it. Thank you, Alex. As Alex said, I'm Marina Robertson. I'm a senior director within the Norse Group. I have spent more than 20 years in local government in the fields of regeneration, property, etc. I did study environmental studies back in 1992 to 1995. That was actually 5 years after the Bradland Commission defined sustainability in 1987. And I've spent the last 20 years trying, opposite to Shaun, and I have spent the last 20 years trying to inject a bit of environmental thinking in regeneration and planning and capital delivery, etc. At the moment, I'm running a consultancy business that gives advice on low carbon. The field is so huge. One of the big challenges we're facing is how many technologies exist to address the myriad of problems we have, and how we can give advice for investments to public sector bodies that are mainly our clients. I spend quite a bit of my time try to second guess what local authorities may need in the future. I'll tell you now, the 2030 targets, if we carry on the way we are at the moment, it is just completely impossible to achieve. So trying to be able to come up with strategies and plans to help local authorities to get to the space where they understand what they need to do to achieve that target is a pleasure to be able to be involved with, but it's also everyday learning for us as well. So a pleasure to see you today. I'm going to learn a lot from my co-panelists today, so I really look forward to it. Thank you, Alex.
Oh, thank you, Marina. And I think all of you have sort of touched on some key themes of this afternoon. And I suppose if we can kind of dive in really with the first question, which is really around the fact, and I know, Marina, you've just said you're not sure 2030 is achievable, but is the challenge of achieving net carbon zero, irrespective of when, we'll take the date out for a moment, but is it really, is it one of science, engineering, is it behavioral or financial? And it's possibly a mix of all four of those, and possibly some that I haven't given some consideration to already. But Shaun, if I can invite you just to kind of come in on that first of all, and then we will kind of wend our way through the panel, if that's okay.
Well, Alex, it is multifaceted, I'm afraid. The challenges facing us to get to net zero involve all of those factors. I'm going to suggest that we actually really look at something very deep, though. And you mentioned behaviours. I'm not sure it's just behaviours. I'm going to go deeper than that, and I think it's actually down to the real will of people. And it's not just one or two; it's the majority, a large majority that want to make this happen. So if you look at the history of the COPs, for example, and I know that it's fraught with its own particular way of working, but fundamentally, this comes down to actually what do people value as being really, really important. And it's, for me, this is probably the biggest barrier, which is actually looking at, why are we doing what we're doing? I heard some, the voices from the other members of the panel and myself, doing this because it's the right thing to do. But actually, it's very deep about, are you doing this for yourself? Are you doing it for others? And are those others in the future? So there's a divorce of timescales over which the benefits of which we are going to be working right now are going to be felt. The people that are going to really benefit from our work now, Alex, are not actually people of my age, perhaps not even of my children, but it'll be my children's children that really are going to be affected if we don't take the actions now. So it's really about the will to do this, for me, is the biggest sort of barrier. And that's a sort of a cultural norm about what we have as values of society that become very, very significant. Now, overlaying that, you've then got, well, what does that feed into? What the rate of technology development, actually the deployment, and therefore the cost and the coming down the experience curve. It feeds lots of others, but it is multifaceted.
I think you raise a really interesting point there, that if you're asking who it's for and who are the beneficiaries of this, ultimately it's the biggest question, isn't it? Ultimately it's the planet that we do, it's the planet, and it's the sort of future of our citizens and our civilians further down the line. And therefore, I guess if everyone's embracing that concept, then, if you like, the science, the engineering, the tools that are going to tackle it will undoubtedly follow through as we learn more and as we invest more in solutions. Marina, I know you have a particular interest in the cultural behavioural aspects of this. Would you care to kind of contribute to that discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I completely agree. It's all about will of the people, because when you really strip it all out, that's what it comes to. And I will emphasize the point Shaun made regarding our legacy as a generation. And I think if we don't act now, future generations will look back to us and call us the second dark ages, because this is really what we're doing now. We're destroying the ability of future generations to enjoy their environment in a way that we have been able to do. And for me, that is really important. And when we talk, and later possibly we'll talk about the kind of skills we need, I think it's really easy to focus on those technical skills and innovation. And I'm the first person to say fund research with the same rigors we have funded research on a vaccine. We are in a national emergency. It is just that the victims of this will not be in 8 weeks' time or 12 weeks' time. They will be in a couple of generations, but it is no less important because of that reason. So we need all kinds of skills. And I think, how do we create will? Communication skills are really important. Illustration skills are really important. Comics and humor to put the right messages across are really important. So it's a whole society that input that really we need to take. Everyone has a role to play, regardless whether they're in a low carbon economy or not.
Okay, thank you. Again, I think it is that long-term picture. Sheryl, would you care to come in on this, because you're here and now putting in sustainable, or sort of you're here and now investing in the sustainable future of Cambridgeshire. How do you marry up the actions now versus the will to want to bring this together for tomorrow?
So, as a local authority, we were subject to quite a lot of youth strikes during 2019 and 2020. And, we had hundreds of people come into our front doors. And it was a really healthy dialogue that started with our politicians and some of our key decision makers. So I remember our leader, Steve Count, having a conversation with a group of young people, a mixture of young men and women, who were articulating their concerns, from food, from the emissions coming from food, from changing our transport systems, from concerns around habitat destruction. And I think for a lot of people, those strikes were really helpful in terms of moving the agenda to the next level. So in terms of both what Shaun and Marina have said, I think the value system of our younger people coming forward, the disposable culture that we've become very accustomed to, when I look at what my teenagers are doing right now in terms of consumption around clothes, they're all buying secondhand. It's acceptable, it's socially acceptable. Now, we have to be there, because I'm not quite sure if we've reached 9 billion people yet, have we, on the planet, or is that 2050? But the fact that we have 9 billion people on one planet, we just can't consume at these levels. So it's interesting, when I look at this question, it's definitely cultural, it's societal, and then I think the finance, engineering and science solutions are going to follow. But it is about will. And I think it's having decision makers who know and are willing to make change happen now. So that's my point.
Thank you, Sheryl. And Patrick, just looking at things from if you like, from the National Trust perspective. I mean, there probably for our audience, there are a couple of different ways of looking at this. One is with the historic kind of buildings and the landscapes that you're custodians of, and tackling the kind of carbon zero approach from that. But also, I guess you as the trust have been, open, certainly during the pandemic, as spaces for people to go to and really enjoy and generate something positive from that natural environment. And have you seen, and has the trust sort of seen that willingness of people to embrace that, or has the trust sort of seen people kind of thinking, there's a place it's open, we'll go there and we can probably get a coffee and an ice cream if we're lucky?
Okay, so let's circle round into the from that position that you just posed, Alex, into the question about which of the four is it. And I think, in principle, it's a Venn diagram, of course it is, across the four things, but everyone's alighted on behavioural and people, and of course that's at the heart of it. We have found over the last year that our places have never been busier, particularly where they're on the urban fringe. So the value people put on access to nature, green spaces, the wider environment has never been more proven, and there's never been a bigger demand. So we're experiencing, high days and holiday peaks. We've experienced them all year in the places that are within reach of people, and there's plenty of evidence from beyond us that demonstrates that to be the case. I was involved in the Climate Assembly as well on the advisory panel, and the report, which was commissioned by the parliamentary select committees jointly, and that was fascinating, because it said to me that there isn't just a glimmer of a mandate here. There is a growing clamour and mandate for action and an appetite to change, and we need behavioural change to be mass movement. I think, as Shaun said, it's got to be everyone who does. In fact, everyone said that. We've all got to step up to the plate here. But the reason that the things like the Climate Assembly and what people say to us when we ask them, should the National Trust be involved in climate change, they say, yes, you should be leading. All of that stuff is new messaging that says to opinion formers and politicians, you have a mandate to deliver policy change. And the only way that we will get things to happen big time will be through some heavy lifting by governments, and they're going to have to face into some tough decisions. So they need to make some more policies. Nobody puts policies in place unless they've got some security of public mandate. So we're circling around into policymakers need to do some heavy shit, but they need to understand they're not going to lose the election as a consequence. So the mandate from the Climate Assembly and all the other things that we're seeing, that people need this to be done and are willing to change, is really, really vital. I think the other big piece I would pick out of your four propositions is the money side. So I think there is quite a lot to be done, and it flows out of policy in some senses, in democratizing the use of money for climate-related action. So let's take the Levelling Up Fund as an example, billions of new quid to do something that's quite politically driven, but that at the moment is boxed off from environmental projects. So there's a lot of money available to do something with one particular single trick pony political aim. We need that to be more generous in how it funds broader action, and local authorities should be able to access that kind of stuff too. I suppose my last bit about finance would be around broadening out its reach and being able to crowd in other parts of particularly local authority areas of action. So until government embraces the value of climate change, carbon action, costs it, prices it, puts it in alongside other metrics that it watches, I don't think that local authorities are going to have much of a chance of making a case for investing the kind of effort and money that they need to invest in order to deliver benefits, which at the moment have no metric that is coherent within a government frame. So I think there are some quite critical changes that need to happen in the structures and superstructures that we have that will follow on to make real the mandate that the public, I think, are now giving us.
And do you think that the policy leading to action, as you rightly say, requires investment, and certainly across the public sector, and it might be different with the trust, it's always been a very traditional mechanism of attracting funding, so i.e. it's government funding coming down to local authorities, or it's taxpayer funding coming back up from the bottom of the chain. How does that financial model need to expand to be able to capture what needs to be done to be able to deliver the policies that we've just been talking about?
Yeah. So this is really heavy lifting, and it's not going to be done vertically, is it? The public money is shrinking. And access for local authorities' public money and even their own budgets are massively shrinking in a really serious way. So looking vertically for government to bail out and to fund all this, and for local authorities to do it themselves, it's not feasible. So it's got to be a more horizontal view of how you attract and crowd in money from different sources. This is not particularly innovative thinking. This is simply a reality that we need the private sector to be able to crowd in alongside the kind of investments that local authorities will be needing to make. And we can give examples of the work we've done on trying to help understand business models for the long-term sustainability of public parks, which is a worse than Cinderella subject in local authority funding, and it needs a different business model. So one of the things that we've been looking at is how the asset base in local authorities can be looked at completely differently and opened up more generously to social entrepreneurs and other wider private entrepreneurs to make better use of them to the benefit of the citizens that live there. So there's a shared equity idea. I'll stop there because others want to come in.
That's okay. No, Sheryl, I know you want to come in, but one of the things I was just going to ask Patrick, if I may, just very quickly before, was whether or not you think as the National Trust is probably easier to access that sort of that funding horizontally, perhaps compared to local authority. Perhaps it's a question I'll put to Sheryl actually, because she's probably more ingrained in local authority budgets and funding mechanisms, and
I have got a view very quickly, which is that I think we're constrained by annual funding settlements, and the obsession with having to balance books over a one-year horizon is not going to deal with a multi-generational issue like climate change, I'm afraid. And local authorities need to be freed up, and I'm sure Sheryl will want to say a bit more about that. So I'll open it up.
Sheryl, floor is yours.
Okay, so I think mine was really about picking up on Patrick's point, which is around the horizontal element. So, for Cambridgeshire County Council, we have a £500 million budget. And actually, a very small amount is just on the organisation, which is running through the staff, etc. What we do have power over is how we procure all those goods and services that deliver for our adult agenda, for our road maintenance agenda, for building bridges, whatever. And what we're really looking at is how do we get hold of the market and specify better so that the market is doing the work of bringing down the carbon emissions collectively. So, for example, the LGA, Local Government Association, has got work that we're doing with universities on trying to get carbon toolkits together so that you can put out these carbon toolkits with your specifications so you can judge what people are saying when they put in their tenders and then make decisions based on either their carbon or their natural capital issues. So I think that's one route of harnessing the market. The other route for us at the moment, I'm doing it quite practically, is sorry, that's somehow my phone's going in internally. Can you hear that?
That's okay.
Sorry, I'm just taking that off. There we go. Is we've set up a shadow carbon price to come in on all of our business decisions. So we're starting off on all of our capital projects. And what we're effectively trying to do is to identify whatever decision you're bringing forward, what is the carbon future cost that you're going to be either putting in and bringing in through climate risks, or the real carbon cost that you're currently going to be emitting through whatever you're doing. And I think the intention over the next year is to deliver a business plan which also has a carbon plan alongside it. We haven't done it yet. We don't quite know how we're going to do it, but that's the intention. And I'm hoping that brings some, I suppose, understanding of how this plays out in terms of public sector finance. It doesn't take away from the fact that there might be more duties or responsibilities or regulatory change, which costs. And that there's a real need if we're going to deliver the 6th carbon budget and how we work with our communities to reduce, there's going to be a cost that's going to come into local authorities that will need to be funded in some way.
Thank you, Sheryl. And I suppose one of the points you made, certainly around that element of procurement, lends itself to a question we've had from the audience from Luke Seaton, who has asked if it's more important to focus on operational carbon or embodied carbon. And I suppose that will lend itself certainly to that tier 3 procurement aspect.
Yes, I mean, actually, it's really interesting. So it also comes around with carbon accounting rules. So, you know, a lot of the sort of the greenhouse gas protocol, which we use in terms of our carbon accounting, tends to focus on operational carbon as opposed to embodied carbon. But you might have seen the discussions that are taking place. So, for example, the EU are looking to put on potentially a border tax on carbon. So if you are producing or offsetting your goods and services into another country which have, let's say, less stringent environmental regulation, that there's a cost for doing that in the environment, and it gets picked up on a border tax potentially. So I think the global regulations that might come through will hopefully help to address some of that. But we've also got to look and understand it better.
Thank you, Sheryl. And I suppose just from the perspective of Marina and Shaun, perhaps coming at it from a different end of the spectrum, back in terms of that sort of funding model that we were talking about before. Do either of you have a perspective on whether you think there is funding coming down the line that's going to help open some of this up, to be able to invest in both the engineering and technologies that are going to help mitigate some of the carbon that we have?
I think one of the huge issues we have is we have placed the heavy lifting, I'll use one of Patrick's phrases, of dealing with climate change on local authorities. And that is ridiculous, really, to be quite frank. They have almost all the responsibility to deliver for the localities, in the UK at least. And it's just imbalanced, completely imbalanced. So that's a key point, and probably another topic for a roundtable conversation at a later date. However, a couple of others, if you don't mind, Alex. One is that we just need to deal with red tape. There is so much governance around accessing funding, and actually asking local authorities to compete with each other to do something that actually everyone should be doing is also completely the wrong way. We apply traditional governance mechanisms around funding for something that requires completely different approach. So I think it is something that we really need to consider in terms of the agility of the system to be able to finance those initiatives. And I suppose the last thing I would say is that local authorities should be given freedoms to use money they hold in accounts like Section 106 and SAIL to release some of that funding, to allow to, as part of the planning obligations, quickly to be able to offset some of those impacts that developments have. And I know we'll go probably on to discussing developments in a second, but I think it is really important to consider the impact of new developments as opposed to retrofitting, for example. And I know Shaun mentioned his involvement with the design for low carbon. So that's me, sorry.
Okay, Shaun?
So Patrick, so on the money front, there is some money that's been thrown by central government into, for example, the area of greenhouse gas removal, and they will sort of raise the flag and say, look, we're throwing in 100 million into research into this area, Alex. And my reaction to this, that's a good start, all right? In terms of the amount of money that we're going to need, right? It's, you know, we need to add some zeros onto the end, at least 2, right? So in terms of the deployment on an annual basis to try and get this thing really flying. So, you know, I think we should be grateful for the fact that there have been some people sort of waking up and saying that we need to do something in this area. But there's a lot more that needs to happen. Second thing is, and Sheryl mentioned this about the value of carbon, and I think that is a conversation that needs to be developed further. Not only, the obvious one, oh, well, carbon is valued too low at the moment, Alex, but actually I think it's a bit richer than that, to do with the quality of the value. So when I move into sort of the world of financial instruments, financial markets, the certainty associated with, for example, a project that reduces carbon, there are risks and timescales associated with other investments that need to be brought into our discussions about how we value carbon. So, for example, if you sequester carbon in a deep underground reservoir and it's going to stay there with high degree of certainty for thousands of years, that, X tons of carbon, should that perhaps therefore be valued differently than a tree, all right, which could therefore be subject to being burnt down in the next 100 years? I'm not saying that has to be. I just think these are questions that we need to be posing. And then the third thing, Alex, is that I know we're talking about finance, but there's more to it, certainly outside of public buildings, but in the private refurb section, it's more than finance. And it comes back to what do householders want, all right, in terms of when do they get. So if I offer somebody a project to go and switch their heating system, but it means actually ripping out all of the radiators, all of the turmoil associated with having builders and things like this. There are other factors, Alex, trust, which will mean actually, even if you offer money about how you go and affect change that's necessary. So it's a bigger discussion than just finance.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I think it's just finding those launch pads, if you like, to jump into the discussions from that people can access, because I think a lot of our audience are going to have to consider these, take them back and work out how they influence and impact change within their organizations to bring about this holistic will of people to make a positive change. So I do agree with that. I'd like to come back to something that Marina raised just a short time ago, which was really around this competing agendas for local authorities. And it seems to me, and I know Sheryl and I touched upon this in a previous discussion on the podcast, around environmental strategies within organizations seem to sort of sit there as a competing agenda, along with a load of other strategic objectives that those organizations are trying to achieve. And I'm just wondering how the panel feels around how organizations really need to transition to enable this agenda to really be the driving force now behind business agendas. So it's no longer just about generating revenue and generating profitability if we're talking about sustainable future and sustainable planet. So therefore, how, and I suppose, Shaun, I was going to start somewhere else, but I'll start with you, Shaun, just to say, in your organization, I suppose it might be a bit of a given in your organization, but does your own approach to your own organizational sustainability, is that the fundamental business strategy that everything else hangs off of, or is it perhaps, as Sheryl might have experienced in local authorities, Marina might experience in local authorities, sit there as a competing agenda, vying for money, vying for resources, and trying to battle its way through to become to become evident on the broader horizon?
Well, it's not going to surprise you when I answer, look, it's all about the mission, what you hold core, and that being absolutely central to everything that you do. Mm-hmm. So it's very simple. It is about actually getting carbon down out of the atmosphere and sorting out climate change. It is, it runs through the core of what we're doing at the Centre for Climate Repair. That actually ran through the core of what I did when I ran the company Breathing Buildings. It was all about reducing the energy of buildings. Now, there were lots of other peripheral things, for example, making spaces amazing, well ventilated, airy, but it was all about reducing the energy. Now, Alex, when you have something, the positive thing about this is that my experience is that when you have something that is truly about trying to do something about climate change, it's like bees to a honeypot in terms of, did I ever struggle to recruit awesome talent? All right, never. All right, because the younger people, the younger generation today, it is not just about chasing the biggest paycheck. Actually, I've seen a transformation in the last 20 years in my work in education about when people are graduating, people are going, what do they want to do with their life? And it comes down to, as I started, about values. And the values that I sort of live by in terms of this agenda is I'd like to leave the planet in a better place than when I found it, in other words, when I was born. And at the moment, actually, much as though I'm trying, the planet actually hasn't got into a better place. But that's what I'm trying to do. And when you have something that's so clear about what you're trying to do, then everything else falls from that and hangs to it, Alex.
Thank you. I think I would be very surprised had you said something different. I'd be calling you out on it had you come up with something different. Sheryl, I know I sort of alluded to the fact in the podcast we recorded and conversation that we had in that perhaps what I'd outlined in terms of those competing agendas was sort of, relevant to your experience of working in local authorities. Do you think there is a move from local authorities to really put this agenda at the heart of its decision making, to make everything else hang off it? Are we there yet?
Okay, so I can talk about where we're at Cambridgeshire County Council, and I think a lot of other local authorities that declared a climate emergency. So we have a corporate objective to reach net zero, and I think that has really helped people focus on doing something different. But I think we have a very diverse set of services that we deliver. So adult social care, schools, education, going through to, building roads or sorting out roads, flooding. And what's really come to light, and I'm in agreement of Shaun, the young people coming forward are so well educated on the environment and getting better by the day. And they're coming out with fantastic PhDs in carbon capture and storage. And so the talent is coming through. The problem is they're not coming straight through into being in a decision-making capacity. So they're then having to learn the governance of their system that they're working in. But I would say that there's been a change over the last 2 years, that the environment is more centre place. I think there's greater priorities being placed on the environment. And I think local authorities across all decision makers, all professions and the politicians are asking to upskill. So, what does carbon mean? What is carbon literacy? And so I have hope that as we upskill in carbon literacy or, natural capital resources and monetising of it, that we will start making different decisions. But, there's still a real cost around the adult social care agenda. And that's real money. So when I go back into Shaun's raising the issue of valuing carbon, and also, I think Patrick earlier was talking about carbon pricing. There is something here that's so important. If you cut emissions, it generally costs more. If you take it out at source, it costs more. So you have a higher carbon cost than if you are planting a tree. So we do need to really work out what that value of carbon is. And we do also need to start getting the, let's say, the regulatory change coming through on how you price fossil fuels. Now, that's a very difficult political decision because you then get wrapped up in, fuel poverty and a whole number of other agendas. So how that's going to come forward or how the narrative is going to change is going to be interesting. But we're definitely moving to a more centralised position of environment than we were even 2 years ago.
And that's really positive. I think the messaging around how you value carbon and its different types of carbon that was alluded to earlier is going to be really key going forward, and establishing, nationally, internationally, a model that everyone can subscribe to and can sign up to, I think is going to be really key. I'd like to, I'm just conscious of time. There was me thinking at the beginning, I've got a whole hour to fill. This is going to be quite hard. And actually we've rattled through and we've not got a great deal of time left. So I want to come on to the point that we sort of opened up the discussion to say we would touch on. And I know we've had a question about it as well from Gregory Radcliffe, which is around, is there an acceptable ratio, considering this is carbon net zero? Not everything needs to be carbon zero. There is a certain amount of offsetting that is allowable. And I suppose, is there a rule of thumb, Shaun, I would expect you to say no, it should be all or nothing, and ultimately we want to get to all or nothing. But is there a rule of thumb that would say that there's an acceptable ratio of greening to offsetting, and what should that look like? I might start with Marina, if I may.
I don't think you can. I don't think we can answer that question. To be quite honest, Alex, I suppose the point I would like to make on here and relating to the previous conversation, as we're looking to reshaping local authorities or decision-making bodies in making those kind of decisions, we need to start thinking for about creating longer-term business plans. Because there is an economic argument when the business plan is 50 years, a 50 years time span or a 100-year time span, because the life costs come into it, and then the different types of decisions can be made, and different types of investment vehicles can be used to enable funding that can support that. With regard to the ratio, ideally, we don't want to offset any carbon. And that's the thing, isn't it? So as little as possible, I would say.
Absolutely. And ultimately, that is the goal, isn't it? But I think we need to move from where we are. And I suppose if we are going to achieve a 2030 target, and I know you said earlier on, Marina, that you weren't convinced that that was achievable. And I suppose there'll be many people listening thinking, yeah, we're not sure how we're going to do that in 8 years effectively. So we have to make positive steps going forward. So is there something of a transition period where we can say, okay, well, we have to start somewhere. We have to start assessing, and I know a lot of organisations are already assessing their own carbon performance and have targets against carbon reduction in their own portfolios. But actually, is there something that you would point to say, you know, maybe between now and 2030 there would be an acceptable ratio of decline? I know you've just said you're not sure because it's all or nothing, but I'll open it up to Patrick, Shaun, or Sheryl. Does anyone else have a different opinion from Marina's? Shaun?
So, I mean, I think it comes back to a question of why you're trying to get to net zero. Is this so you can say that you're a net zero? I mean, it's a philosophical sort of issue that I'm really grappling with, because what we really care about is the planet, and therefore we should be trying to work as hard as we can to reduce our emissions. Bang, that's fairly obvious. But the challenge comes back down to money, where it actually leads very nicely from what Sheryl was saying earlier, which is, the problem is, let's say you find out that it's a lot cheaper to do the last 20% by going and sort of buying some trees and stopping deforestation, or in the Amazon, than it is to go and actually really do the hard lifting, as Patrick said, regarding making your building really, really low energy. So where do you stand on that? You know that you should, all right, go for making your building really, really low energy, and yet it's going to be cheaper to get to that same ton of carbon by going and buying the trees. So hence, it then relates to how are we pricing carbon, over what timescales, what are the purposes? Is it somebody else's emissions effectively that you are paying for? And it's about lifestyle. So are you really doing this so that you can preserve your current lifestyle? Let's go full hog and say, I'm not going to reduce my emissions at all. I'm going to do it all through offsets, just so that I can maintain my lifestyle today, and I'll just pay a bit more. We know that that's wrong, Alex. So it comes back down to where you stand in your philosophy regarding this whole agenda and the role of offset. And I think the answer, therefore, is non-trivial. And I would hope that we think very, very hard about doing everything that we possibly can to sort out our own mess before we then go and buy some offsets, cheap offsets somewhere else.
I do agree. When we had some work done by Cambridge University Science and Policy Exchange, they looked at Cambridgeshire's carbon emissions across, key sectors like transport, heating, agriculture, waste, etc., land use change. And then we've also got in Cambridgeshire some fantastic lowland peat, but we've also got some very degraded lowland peat. The resolution of this work was that we probably won't get down to carbon zero by 2050. We're going to have a residual level of carbon. And so then the issue is saying, well, what is that? What does it look like? And what can we do locally about it? So when we talk to some of our businesses, you know, there are, let's say, businesses supplying Tesco's with meat, lamb and beef. They're saying, well, we are going to take time to be able to change what is a fundamental business model to come to the point of delivering net zero. So I think there is a transition to help people move. I think if we are offsetting, we're not offsetting globally, you know, at $7 an acre or whatever it is for tree planting. You're saying, how are you helping your next door neighbour to reduce your carbon emissions until we get to that point where we think that there is that bit, as you've highlighted, Shaun, that either is just very, very difficult to do, or there's a cheaper way of doing it. There's a lot to do before you get to that point, though.
So, Alex, let's put everything on the table. We can't tackle climate change by just doing emissions and not attending to sequestration, as Shaun said. You've got to do both. I've got sympathy with particularly organisations, companies, local authorities who have done their level best to drive emissions down. So let's make sure we start there. The first job to do is drive your emissions down. There are then a suite of hard to treat emissions where either the technology or the public behaviours have not caught up with the ability to reduce the emissions and still fulfil the task or the action that is attached to it. Aviation's a good example. We're not there yet, but nobody's stopping flying tomorrow. Well, some people are, but the world isn't. And we've got to be realistic about there's going to be a transition period. So I think none of this is easy. So, you know, rather trite solutions that we might come up with in a 10-minute discussion ain't going to do it. But what we should accommodate is that we absolutely drive emissions down, and then we put in play the best situation we can possibly achieve in order to buy the planet time to come back in with some of the other solutions that are going to be necessary. But all of this is going to require, and this is why COP26 is so important this year, is country leadership to commit and then incentivize financially the appropriate actions and the right policies that will allow individual local authorities to make their best endeavours. And if they're penalised in some way and have to reach for offsetting, and heaven forbid that there is some kind of encouragement to trade in the voluntary market of offsets, then we are lost, because there just isn't enough offset around to deal with the problems that we have. And there's nothing. I mean, it pains me greatly to see the kind of fig leaf offset offers that I see being dangled in front of people by large corporates looking for the easy way out when they do have opportunities to drive emissions down, and it will squeeze profits. Well, that's the world we're in.
And Alex, I'm just going to say, Patrick, thank you so much. I couldn't agree more strongly with you. And hence, as I laid at the beginning, the first two objectives of the Centre for Climate Repair are going hell for leather on deep and rapid emissions reduction. Do absolutely everything you can. But then greenhouse gas removal, which serves two things. One is the either impossible or ridiculously hard to abate sections, but also then going harder than zero to get to negative emissions, because unfortunately, actually, we're in a terrible place right now, and therefore we need to take carbon dioxide out.
I think there are some. I think there is the sort of the ultimate goal which we're talking about here, and you're all absolutely right that you've got to strive for that, because there's no point striving for anything less. I think the local authorities, certainly in my experience that I've been working with, are still perhaps looking at things as a very much a short-termist view to say, but I still need to demonstrate progress now. And there's a question from Paul Inch, who is asking really about ensuring that offsetting is wrapped up within sort of planning conditions. So therefore using that as a stairway to trying to get to a zero emissions target. So using the planning powers and potentially going beyond that to sort of say, okay, well, if we can, rewild brownfield sites, greenfield, and using the planning laws to help local authorities have some teeth, then potentially there's something in that. Patrick, I know you'd like to come in.
Well, just on that set, because you read the direct question, that worries me, that you could use powers to encourage a sort of a broader offset approach to things, particularly for new developments. I think this is where governments and local authorities have to step up to the plate, to be honest, and say, I'm afraid you've got to give us a low carbon version of your development. And simply going and picking up some brownfield forestry with very little, potentially little assurance attached to it that that's going to persist more than about 10 years. We're all scarred by the countryside and urban areas scattered with Section 106 agreement projects, which were sexy for 3 years and have gone completely into disrepair. I really worry about that and our ability to police and maintain those things. But I was going to say that one of the things that really helped National Trust, because we've got a 2030 net zero target across our whole value chain, so we're in quite an aggressive position. We've just the thing that really helped us was when we pulled together our full carbon account. So we absolutely went across all our various points of emission and our potential for sequestration, and we put a balance sheet together, and we used the 6 carbon budget methodologies to try and look at the pluses and minuses, and effectively took a graphics equalizer approach, if people are old enough like me to remember those tools, where you can dial up your treble and your bass depending on what you wanted to achieve. It was really helpful for just making it feel real and realistic to see across all our bits of our business, from our investment portfolio through to our the way we manage our countryside sites and everything in between, commercial, tea rooms, very much like a local authority, our residential let estate, really understanding where the big hitters were. And when we could see, and actually it came down to what's the top 4? If we're going to make a real dent in this mission, what are the top 4 emitters and how are we going to tackle them? Let's get a plan. But until you had the comfort of knowing, it was really, really scary. But as soon as you can put your arms around your carbon account and understand your plan for delivering reductions, where can we change our land use to get some sequestration that could inset a little bit of that off where it's hard to treat, that stuff really, really helped. As it happens, 2030 is dead aggressive. So we've got not very much wriggle room, and it is costly. But do you know what? It's going to get more costly is the other thing we found the longer we wait.
Yeah.
That's very, very true. And if we may, a really valuable point in which to bring a close to the discussion. Unfortunately, because I actually keep this going for ages, but I think fundamentally probably other people have other obligations that they need to go to. So just in terms of wrapping up, I'd really like to thank you all for your time this afternoon. It's been absolutely fascinating. I think we've touched on some really interesting points, and unfortunately in an hour we've only had time just to really touch on those points and then move on to something else. But it's been absolutely stimulating. The great thing from my perspective is that the audience that have stayed with us for the entire time. I haven't seen them drop off or at any point, so hopefully we've kept them interested as well. So for our audience, thank you for staying with us and for your questions. Apologies if I didn't get to ask them all. Please don't forget to go to the Spaces website for more information about a virtual conference in June, where we'll be discussing these and another wide range of topics with some more wonderful guest speakers. But certainly from myself, from Sheryl French, Marina Robertson, Patrick Begg, Shaun Fitzgerald, I'd like to thank you all for your time this afternoon, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Alex.
Alex.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.